Ain't you sick of giving me your money?
Oh, it's oh. I know he didn't do it, baby.
Hold on a second. Whoa. Where you going?
No, I'm about to go make these drop balls.
Hey, what's going on? This is DLO Bradley Thomas. By day, I am a marketing and IT professional. By night, I am an MC producer. And let me pass the mic.
Hey, what's good? It's your girl, Opal Elisa. By day, I'm director of multicultural business strategy for a large financial firm. By passion, I am an MC, a poet, spoken word artist, and author. I'll pass the mic.
What's going on? My name is Corey Whitmore, owner of Media 22, Studio 22, Radio 22. By night, you'll probably see me in the studio. By day, I've been working on these festivals. It's about to be summer. So it's a real busy time, but I'm excited.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff going on, going on. But the major thing we got going on right now, we have a very special guest. He has over 15 years of impacting people with various strategies from large, mid-sized organizations. He's been very focusing on coaching, developing, advocating for the growth of ethnically diverse individuals. And there's so much more that I could say about him, but I would rather him say that. And that's the reason why we brought him on today. So welcome to the Black Currency Podcast, Mr. Victor Patterson. How you doing?
I'm good. Good to see all of you all. Honored to be with you today. Excited about the conversation that we will have over the next 30, 45, 60 minutes.
Absolutely. So I was reading through your bio, and one of the questions that kind of came to mind is how did you go from the block to the boardroom? Like what was that past like? What kind of inspired you to take the current path that you're currently on right now?
Yeah, so I think for me, DLO, it started with just growing up. I'm a product of the suburbs of Chicago, Illinois area, and consciously understanding that my household, what I was going through, was very different than some people that I was going to school with. And so that immediate image, it triggered something in me that became curious to me. And so always being humble and curious and asking the right questions to the right people just kept me moving forward. As I got into school, played basketball throughout. Basketball got me out of my hometown, thank God for that. More and more happened. And I think that what I learned early on about being curious, about being humble, about the value of relationships, just continued to give me more and more and more opportunity. And as you mentioned, DLO, there came a point in time where I said, you know what, I need to move this from where I am to the higher levels. And as you alluded to, the higher levels for me were current seat, being senior executive, interacting with C-suite leaders and organizations, and really having the opportunity to impact strategy, be a voice for oftentimes the voiceless, and also being able to influence decisions that impacted those who historically have been underrepresented in our corporate structure.
Okay, cool. Thanks. One more tip for our listeners too. Y'all know that I always take notes, so I'm sitting here right now, soaking up the game from Victor. So if you don't have a notepad, it's a lot better when you write things down, so you can actually remember it, and it goes into your mind a lot deeper. So I just wanted to tell everybody out there listening, whether you're looking at this on YouTube, grab a notebook. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. 'Cause, yeah, you dropped plenty gems at the Wealth Literacy Conference where we all saw you at for the first time. So again, very excited to have you and have my pen ready to take some notes. So I know that you are a human resources executive and also someone who is an advocate, especially for folks that look like us, for folks of color, for women. So what tips do you have when it comes to recruiting and retaining talent, especially talent like ours? And I would love it to be kind of on both sides. So a lot of our listeners are entrepreneurs and business owners. So when they're thinking about recruiting and retaining, and then a lot of our folks are listeners like myself who are entrepreneur, but also work at a corporation and thinking about how I'm seen as talent. So if you could speak a little bit to that, I think that'd be, I would love to hear what you got to say.
Absolutely, Opal. And I'll address it from the way you presented it. I think first and foremost, when you're an entrepreneur, what I've learned, specifically when I was an entrepreneur, is I understood what led me to entrepreneurism. And I understood that well, which is why I chose that path. And as entrepreneurs, oftentimes our line of sight is really linear. And we do that when our marketplace is linear and peripheral. So what's important is that the people that we bring into our space as an entrepreneur, we approach that relationship with humility, and we are always listening. What I often tell people in corporate environments, and I was having this conversation a little over an hour ago, is the mistake that leaders make is they seem to think, and this may not always be the case, but they seem to think and act as if they're the only ones with an understanding of what's going on in and outside the marketplace.
Okay.
The truth of that is when you talk to those that may be making an hourly wage, they're just as adept, tuned in, and wise to what's going on as this person over here. And for me, in many cases, I found myself asking again the right questions of those hourly employees and letting them impact my strategy, which is being rolled out to a broader group of employees. And so for an entrepreneur, I would say just be in tune to those individuals that you're employing and always acknowledge them as value to what you're working to create. That could be as small as a thank you. It can be as large as a bonus, but in between, it should always be, let me help you understand how we performed over this month or quarter. And let me also communicate the impact that you had on that. And I'm grateful for that. In the corporate environment, I think it's the same way. It may be just a little bit more complex. It is critically important that whatever organization you're in, you understand that the marketplace is not homogenous. And so, Opal, you're the marketplace. DLO is the marketplace. Corey's the marketplace. Our brother Jose may be the marketplace. And so to believe that one person or a group could thoroughly represent the uniqueness of a vast and diverse marketplace, that's naive. So what I've always done, Opal, has been very intentional in working with my business partners. There's the language of business. And I think all ethnically diverse professionals need to understand the language of business. It is always about delivering value. And we all need to step forward and understand what that means for the organizations that we're working with. I think beyond that, it takes a leader and or the human resources function to understand that every opportunity is an opportunity to create an inclusive environment. If there is a unique problem that an organization is working with and they decide that the best route to come up with a sustainable solution is to create a project team, Opal should be on that project team, Mary should be on that project team, Rosita should be on that project team, Juan should be on it, DLO. that project team, that sustainable solution, it impacts those markets. And the only people that truly understand those market environments intimately are the people who are reflective and representative of those markets. And so I would say that, how you position yourself to be viewed as a value. Opal, it's important to understand the language of business and how your organization exists from year to year. Being able to understand the economics and the financial side of that. And if you don't, being humble and curious enough to go to the VP of finance or the VP of strategy and say, can you talk to me about this quarterly report? Indoctrinate me into the language of business. The other thing, and we talked about this at the Wealth Literacy Conference, is the image of business. You want people to be curious and interested in you as much as you may be interested in them. And so being able to build relationships with anybody and everybody throughout that organization is critical.
So many gems.
And it has my mind moving right now,
Yeah.
but I got to stay focused because
I see BLO moving.
Yeah.
So talking about recruitment and retention, the other part that I think is crucial, that I think aids, that can help, especially with the retention aspect, is the business culture. So one, for folks that may not understand what I mean by business culture, can you, one, define it, and then two, tell us why that's important? Because especially with small businesses and folks that are just starting out, that are getting their first, second, third, fourth employee, I heard someone tell me that, if you don't pay attention to your culture, it'll form on itself. So one, like I said, can you define that for folks that are unfamiliar with culture? And then two, and let us know why that's so important.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, the business culture, or just culture in general, is the atmosphere, the spirit, and the movement of an organization. And it's such a deep definition that requires you to be attentive to what you see and can define, but to also be as equally attentive to what you don't necessarily see and can't define. And as I said I saw the look, where one of the things that I said at the Wealth Literacy Conference is make sure that you understand what's actually being said to you. And typically what happens is people hear something and they have an instinctive response. In corporate America, what you hear isn't always what's being said. And so sometimes you have to take in a message, meditate on it, and make sure that it actually lines up with what your instinct was. Oftentimes people are talking to you about something that relates to the performance of the business, an individual, the strategy. It may come out in a unique way. That's why you have to be careful in how you act. And so culture is, as I said, ultimately it's the spirit of the organization and how the organization moves. Now, I think the other thing that becomes very obvious to that, particularly with those ethnically diverse professionals or people of color, is when you walk into an organization, is it reflective and representative of you? And if it is not, one, you probably should ask questions, but two, make sure that you understand that most organizations are older, more mature, more sophisticated than you are on day one. So it becomes very difficult for an individual to try and force a round peg into a square hole. And you have to be comfortable accepting that what this place was when I walked in is probably what it's going to be like if there is nothing in the mission, the values, and you don't ascertain anything from the strategy that suggests that it's evolving in a way that's going to make you feel valued, inclusive.
That's on point.
Right.
Yeah.
You said that like a straight boss.
Okay.
I feel you 1,000%. That is, I'm so glad that you said it that way too. Like you have to match with the culture and not try to make the culture match to you. I like that approach. Speaking about culture, I'm very interested because I know you have a lot of experience building cultures. What are some of the core elements of a culture that that help an organization thrive and that make them strong and get them in a position where they can consistently evolve even with the days and times?
Dealer, that's a good question. That is a really good question. I would say leadership. I would say clarity in mission, values, and strategy, and accountability. Building culture ultimately becomes conscious awareness and repetition of behavior. It becomes somewhat easy when you have clarity, alignment around your mission and values, when an organization is able to hold people accountable for veering from that. And listen, accountability can be as small as me saying, oh, but let me pull you aside and let me have 5 minutes of your time. Or it could be, Scott, we talked about this 30 days ago. I'm gonna have this conversation with you again. Help me understand what you missed the last time, and let's make sure we get it together. Or it could ultimately mean we've had a number of conversations about this previously, and it just appears to me right now that you're not right for the organization. And there's a more tactful way of saying that. But ultimately, if you are committed and passionate and moving to creating a culture that delivers value to external stakeholders, that is a high performance organization internally, and that is one that's inclusive for any and everyone, you can't have these outliers. And there comes a point in time in the fiscal calendar where you have to make those decisions. And the last thing that I would say, DLO, is you have to create this diverse and inclusive. And I would argue today, for me, inclusion is more important than the word diverse or diversity. I think that a number of organizations understand that what that is, should be moving towards that. Once you get those employees inside, what you do with them and how you go about that creates the vibrancy, the sustainability, the retention that every organization is talking about today. You also find yourself stimulating those minds and the energy of people who more often than not find themselves silent.
Yeah.
That's right on the head.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
That is. I mean, again, just so much in that piece, and I love the accountability piece. To me, like all sorts of firecrackers going off, especially when you talk about like, is it in the mission, right? Is it in the strategy? Because that is when you think about what work gets done is the work that's prioritized. And if you're making a decision, the first thing someone's going to go back to, well, what lines up with the strategy, right? And if that inclusion piece isn't in there, if diverse consumers and customers and their needs aren't in there, it's on the back burner. It's a nice to have, but it's not what we're doing. So I love that piece. Also, like you talked about, I think you hit on this a little bit, but you talked about kind of the larger culture of the whole organization, but want to get into like teams and how those work. So you talked about, if there's a project team, it needs me plus Mary plus Jose, right? To have those diverse insights. But what about like having those super talented individuals? What tips and ideas do you have for making that a team, right? So those folks need to work together. And sometimes we think about folks who are superstars and they're so talented in their lanes. How do you make those diverse teams come together when those backgrounds and not even past situations, but current situations probably a lot different for me than someone else, right? So how do you make that team kind of work?
Yeah, it has to be a constant conversation, Opal. And I go back to creating clarity. One of the things that I did at a previous employer to get to where I think you're talking about is there was so much ambiguity in the space. And ultimately, I kind of stopped the presses for a moment and focused on making sure that we understood what skills and what competencies were going to define the business that we were responsible for leading. The other thing that I did is part of my strategy, I made sure that performance management was incorporated as a consistent pillar, not just when I was getting close to having to have organizational succession planning meetings, but if my business partner and I are looking at the scorecard on a monthly basis and we see a fall off over the previous 2 months, well, we know who that leader is. And performance management suggests that we need to pull Sandra aside and say, hey, what's going on here? And help Sandra get that business unit back. And ultimately, when you have that type of infrastructure, the cream rises to the top. And so what I was able to do in leading from an HR standpoint, this group of people, was I was able to identify them. And as we had opportunities, whether that was employee engagement strategy or whether that was solving something that was new to us, I was able to pull people that were products of those conversations that were right where we needed them to be and say, hey, Patrick, hey, Mark, let's take these two people and put them here. So now what we're doing is we're creating a high impact solutions team, but we're also incubating what looks like an inclusive environment for us. It also has to be intentional. And I had a conversation like today, and I said, part of my concern today, organizations are viewing DE&I as a program. And it needs to be a collaboration between those people who are responsible for DE&I and those HR people, whether it's a CHRO, whether it's the VP of HR or the director of HR, who may be leading functions and or dispersed businesses. The reason for that is we are having conversations with those functional leaders, sometimes 3 times a day for 5 days a week. Where the DE&I practitioner may only get 3 times a fiscal year to be in front of those people.
Yeah.
And so what I was able to do in creating a succession plan of 27%, which was less than 5% when I started, was because I was having conversations with my business partners often. And we were making change.
So that, I'm sorry. I
just wanted to make sure I answered Opal's question.
Absolutely.
So that even gets a little bit into my question, and I love this discussion because this has actually been a lot of the DEI stuff has been on my mind of late. And how would you? So let's take for instance that one of us is basically put in a position of leadership in an organization that does not have diversity. that has very limited diversity.
Mhm.
How would you go about, or what? Yeah, I guess the word would be, how would you go about to prep that workforce to be able to move in a place of, one, diversity, but two, as you say, inclusion, which can come in after that. I bring that up because I think this goes across businesses. This goes from school systems that are trying to, that are becoming more diverse, that are trying to adapt. And I see a lot of organizations that have leadership dictated to say, hey, this is how we're moving, but they have a workforce that is sometimes unwilling or resistant to that movement in that direction. So how does a person, I guess, how would you go about prepping a workforce for diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, Corey, you gotta put your lungs through preseason training. Because it is a project, process, work. It is a roller coaster of highs and sometimes very unimaginable lows. I will say to you that in today's environment, your shocking moments may be even more of a shock than they were 3, 4, 5 years ago.
Wow.
And so I share that as the backdrop to my answer. Understand that any and every business is in the business of creating value.
Yeah.
And that may be $1 more this year than they made last year. And for them, that signals progress. And so I think as you talk about yourself being one of only in an environment that may be talking about creating a more diverse environment, first and foremost, Corey, I would put myself in a position to understand what does that mean for the organization. And if the organization is void of professionals of color, now I'm having a conversation with the talent acquisition group. I need to understand what is that relationship like? Is your strategy in any way, shape, or fashion connected to this, what we're trying to do here? And how can I be a resource to do that? That doesn't always mean you immersing yourself in the TA function. What it does mean is you can direct TA to groups or resources that will give them an opportunity to build a relationship with a qualified group of professionals of color. Now, on the back end, you get to have repeated conversations about progress. How are we doing? What's the challenge? And so it's almost like you're taking on a job and a half. But at that point, that's where your preseason training comes in. I will also tell you, Corey, that there are moments where you have to have what in corporate America we call courageous conversations. In our neighborhoods, we just talk, we talk grown man, grown woman conversations, right? And some of us call it keep it 100 conversations. But we have to have those conversations in corporate America. And when you have those conversations, you always pull from the perspective of this is my understanding of the organization's strategy and pursuit. Always tie it to what the organization is advocating, whether it's internally and externally. You also should make sure that you have data that is going to support. This is why I, Corey, am revisiting this topic and or questioning, and this is what the data is telling us. How do we pivot on what hasn't been progress so that we do achieve progress? Once you get them in the building, and you know that you have qualified, capable, and talented people, you have to find opportunities for that talent to shine.
Mm.
You become an advocate, mentor, sponsor, what have you. You're coaching those individuals on the culture and the atmosphere. So you're not leaving them isolated on the island that they're in.
Yeah.
But you are advocating amongst your peer group that they be a part of these project teams so that they can grow, and ensuring that they have a tremendous employee experience. Now what they do is they become advocates for the organization and advocates for TA.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I loved a couple of the things you said in there, especially when you said if you're the only, you kind of go to that talent team and you say, what is your strategy, right? So one of my favorite DEI leaders always says, like, be hard on systems and soft on people. And I feel like when you put it on the strategy, that can take away all that bias and the defensiveness that would come up, like, why y'all ain't hiring no Black people, right? It's like, no,
Right.
let's take it. Then you also brought in the data piece, I think, too, which is like, it's just math at that point, right? Like, here goes this is the truth. So I love that you brought those pieces in there because, yeah, that's your own strategy to be able to do it and to take that personal piece out of it and to really get to that business. So love that.
And Opal, if you recall, one of the things that I encouraged the attendees to invest in is understanding what makes America tick.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, America is a competitively arrogant country for all of the right reasons. And I impressed upon the attendees, whether you're watching Bloomberg, CNBC, or reading the Wall Street Journal, elevate your understanding of economics in America. For that exact reason, Opal, at the end of the day, whatever it is that you want to change, it shouldn't be about the feel good of doing it. It should be about advancing it for the purposes of value to the organization. And that's where you're going to get engagement on that conversation. And you're not going to find yourself being appeased by someone who otherwise just probably don't care.
Thanks.
I love that you keep going back to value because that's a very, very difficult point for anyone to argue in any type of meeting or setting, because you're talking about everybody that's in the room and how it's affecting them. I love that angle. You kind of talked about it a little bit, but I would be interested in I guess your opinion on the implementation of DEI in large corporations. You kind of talked about it earlier. You felt like they might be getting the diversity and the engagement part right, but the inclusion is missing. I guess, what is your opinion on what these large corporations are doing with DEI, like implementing it?
Yeah, so I think it's hit or miss, and what I'm about to say is not Victor saying it, but it's been researched. It's been reported on in the Wall Street Journal. You have some of your larger consulting agencies in this country that are global entities that have done research on it as well. And we had an epiphany moment in this country from a corporate perspective when George Floyd unfortunately lost his life. Everybody reacted to that. They seemed outraged and they seemed committed to systematically and holistically changing. As the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, New York Times, and other local, state, regional newspapers have reported, it has been far short of what the euphoria suggested was going to happen. And so DLO, again, some companies do it right. And I had a conversation today. And I think one of the things that's critically important, we talk about cultural competency. And I think that's real. I think understanding the uniqueness of the Latino population, the Asian population, the African American population, and certainly if you're one of those ethnically diverse groups, the Caucasian environment. You have to understand that in order to gain an appreciation for it. If your life has been socially isolated from those unique groups in the country, it becomes very difficult to gain an appreciation. I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm just saying it becomes very difficult to develop a sustainable appreciation for the uniqueness, the talents, the capacity of those groups. With that being said, I believe it's critically important, DLO, for the HR departments across our large organizations to ensure that they have diverse HR functions, because some of that cultural competency can be developed through seemingly uncomfortable conversations, which are had behind the doors, closed doors. But the development that takes place in those conversations, if you are homogeneously, if you have a homogeneous HR function, it becomes difficult for you to advocate that your organization functionally, TA, should be actively, consistently penetrating markets that are very different. And I can say that from my experience, you have to be comfortable. You have to be authentically comfortable having a normal conversation with DLO.
Right.
Because if you don't,
right.
And if you're not, DLO is from one of those neighborhoods where he understands real and fake. And that's real.
Right.
I can tell you, and I think I said it at the conference, I grew up in the middle of 3 of the nation's most notorious street gangs. What did I learn from that experience? To keep my eyes open, to make sure my senses were always heightened, to keep my mouth closed. You can debate that all you want, but I know that there were people who didn't adhere to that I wouldn't be here to have this conversation with you and I.
Right.
And so that's a real skill and competency. It's a real understanding, and it has allowed me to interact with white people who didn't grow up in that area, my Latino brothers and sisters who were a part of that community. I was in their homes. And so when you develop that, then I know you're getting to inclusion, but once you have that, then you can effectively and consistently and sustainably. And I think it's important for your listeners to understand how important it is for me to use the words that I'm using. I use consistently and I use sustainably, which is very different than a one-off moment.
Yes.
I'm building legacy. I'm building relevancy and viability, not just for the organization in the quarter, but the people that I bring in, empower, coach, develop, and promote are ultimately going to make sure that the market or the community rallies around the organization, but they're going to make sure that the organization is viable for a much longer period of time than that moment.
Yes.
And that's value.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I was noticing that too. Like you are very, very intentional with your words when it comes to that sustainability piece. That is so huge. So you talked about some things like being able to have those courageous conversations. What are some of the other traits that you see in someone who's going to be a successful business leader? What are some of those other things that pop up? I feel like you've hit on so many of those pieces. If you could kind of bundle that up, what would that be?
I think being a critical thinker and being a strategist. For me, I think there's a level of humility, certainly leadership, passion for results, strong understanding of relationships, and I'm thinking about this from the perspective of an entrepreneur and an employer or an employee. And I think not being afraid of the data. The data, more times than not, is really accurate. How you receive it, how you interpret it, and how you pivot against it keeps you successful, keeps you relevant, keeps you viable. Oftentimes may help, particularly an entrepreneur, may help you realize that you need to go elsewhere to get some wisdom instead of continuing to grind through the same process and approach that led you to the result that the data has communicated to you.
Can you repeat that again? One more time. Like, that was golden what you said. I love that you said that.
Yeah, I think it's so important, DLO, that we understand that the data is often the result of a period of time in the past. Right, wrong, or indifferent, it is so important for us to take a breath, to understand the data, and to be able to pivot and know that you can't continue to grind in your process and expect that the data will tell you something differently at a point in the future. I mean, you've lost. And in many respects, you've put yourself further behind the 8 ball than you were when the data first told you that you were making wrong moves.
Thanks. I feel like we're also, in addition to business owners and leaders, all of us are artists. So I feel like his point about data is so true because, like, at least for myself, sometimes I put out something I know it's going to be good, but more often than not, I put out something that I think is not what it's going to be. And that's what people like, right? And so, you got to pay attention to that and pivot, or even how you do some social media stuff, right? Like you got to pay attention to that. So I feel like that hit home for me on like 10 different levels. That was
Yeah, that was like a life gem. You know, you just can't keep doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Like you got to be humble enough to accept what your results are. Yeah.
Correct. And have people around you that can pat you on the back, can give you a hard message, but are also so invested in you that when you come to them in that moment, they're going to run for that resource just like you're running for the resource.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that part.
All of that.
Right.
That part. Well, no, I meant everything.
Right.
You have a unique experience with working, coaching, and developing teams with Home Depot and Target and HB Fuller. I wonder if there are things that entrepreneurs and small business people can take from some of the practices of some of these larger corporations. Are there things that you've seen there that you feel that entrepreneurs or small business owners can incorporate into what they do?
Yeah, good, really, really good question, Corey. And I'll preface that by saying I share with people that I am a business professional leading human resources. And so when people ask me to explain that, then I tell them, I go into my academic background, which has nothing to do with human resources, but more specific to their inquiry becomes, I am passionate about the outcomes of business. And so part of it is for an entrepreneur is create processes that build efficiency. In the business world, we talk about operating profit or operating margin. And effectively what that is how impactful or how swiftly are your processes and people moving to the outcome? Is there any waste within your operation that ultimately has an impact on your profit? Or it could be your revenue. And if it's your revenue, then it's certainly your profit. I think discipline. And for an entrepreneur, you can bow that to process. In the corporate environment, discipline is nurtured through performance management. Talked about that a little bit earlier. I think clarity around communication, how the business is performing, what are the challenges that we have ahead of us? And I go back to something I said earlier in the conversation. Your employees, whether they have a vested ownership in the business or not, they know how the business is trending.
Mm-hmm.
And so don't make the mistake that they don't, or that you know something that they don't. They may not know the inner workings of what you're dealing with on a daily basis, but they know the spirit of trend. So being open and honest. I think the other thing that's so important is recognition, communicating value to your people. At the end of the day, and I've said this for over probably 15 years now, there are some amazingly talented people that do a tremendous job of creating strategy. Strategy in and of itself is an exercise. The success of the strategy is how well the people move against it. When you demean, disregard, dismiss, and don't value your people, you just spend a whole lot of time on a really, really, really nice document that did not pay dividends. And if it's really bad, you've got to report to the C-suite on why it didn't. And if the C-suite has been put on notice, they got to report to the board of directors. Nobody wants to have that conversation. So lift your people up. And then the last thing that I said that I think really goes in part to the spirit of what we're talking about is hire a team of people that look like you and don't look like you.
That goes right into the diversity piece.
Right.
That's the whole foundation of a good portion of this conversation, all brought together. I love it. I love it, man. We always ask, and I know you made some great recommendations at the Wealth Literacy Conference. So you can go back to those books, or if there's something else that has, that you're reading or getting into, we always love to leave our audience with book recommendations. So if you have some, what are you reading?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think what I had mentioned when I was there is I was reading The Jewish Phenomenon. And I think that's applicable to everyone. The deeper that I've got, and this is a book that I've read twice, the deeper that I have gotten into that, the principles that this group of people has used to build their wealth, their cultural position, and their influence in this country, it is not rocket science. So I think the principles of that book are good. I may or may not have talked about Damon John's The Power of Broke.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really, really good book particularly for entrepreneurs. I think it's also a good book for corporate employees who, in the depths of their spirit, have a desire, some of them have a desire, a dream, and an intrigue, even when they're being paid during work hours, to do more or to do something different.
Mm-hmm.
Damon's book, The Power of Broke, really begins to manifest that. I think those two, in addition to, and then the other thing that I'm reading, I know that was the question, is I constantly read Inc. magazine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I constantly read Inc. magazine. And for entrepreneurs, that's your community.
Mm-hmm.
Inc. is literally your community. It also oftentimes has articles from some of the more global names, leaders, influencers that we know that aren't necessarily leading small or mid-sized businesses, but the wisdom that they share is applicable to business owners.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Thank you.
You got it here. 3 book recommendations for y'all. So y'all got some work to do for those people watching and listening. Y'all got some work to do. It's also great to be here with the fellow podcaster, with Tee to Green Golf Podcast. Can you please tell us about that and where folks would be able to access that to be able to listen?
Absolutely. And I thank you all for giving me a chance to talk about this a little bit. I'll answer the last question first. It is available on Apple. It's available on Spotify, and then there are many other podcast platforms that you can locate the podcast on. The podcast is really doing well. I just did some data last night, and my downloads are up 205%.
Nice.
Versus
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Today versus February.
Nice.
The podcast in and of itself is to really give voice to the people of color, whether they're playing the sport, whether they're entrepreneurs in the sport, whether they're on the back end of the sport, or whether they are part of a number of female-based golf groups, male-based golf groups that have really revived golf. And it's important that folks hear that, because when the pandemic hit, it was not widely talked about, but golf was in a financial crisis. And so I don't think it's out of bounds to say that the evolution in particular of Black golfers in the US gave it vibrancy, whether that was on TV or whether that was at these courses from coast to coast. So now we have our Latin brothers and sisters playing. We certainly have the Asian community playing, but it is really to give voice. Male and female, golfers of color, entrepreneurs of color that are in the golf industry, influencers. I'm working on a golf coach at an HBCU. I'm looking at Black caddies. So I'm really giving voice and comfort and confidence to our communities that golf isn't foreign to us. We have always had a place hand in it. and the hand is bigger today than it was yesterday.
Dope.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Love that.
Mm-hmm.
So we got book recommendations for y'all, and we got a podcast subscription. Like, share, whatever button's in front of you, hit all of them. Green Golf Podcast. So make sure to check that out. It was amazing to see you at the Wealth Literacy Conference. And we're blessed to be able to have you be a part of this for the Black Currency Podcast, and you to come on here and share this knowledge and wisdom with us. So thank you. Thank you for your time, and thank you for I got at least a page full over here.
I do too. Fabulous.
Of notes. It's really been incredible. And I think you've laid out what's great about this, at least for me, is I think you've laid out a blueprint, not for only things for entrepreneurs and small business owners to look at and to implement. Oh, but there's some large companies and nonprofits that I feel need to out some of this and implement into what they're doing as well.
Yeah, Corey, thank you. Listen, it's my pleasure. I'm humbled by this opportunity. The one thing that I always want you all and your audience to know is, for as much as there seems to be angst and tension today in this country that we live in, the country needs us, and we need you all. Your ideas are of value. Your thoughts are of value. What we have to do is we have to help you get to a place where your voice is being heard. And so I tip my hat to Black Currency, because you all are doing that. Keep doing what you're doing, and let's keep lifting each other up when we have those bad days.
Absolutely.
Mic drop. Mic drop.
Right there.
Love it.
There's no more that can be said after that.
Right. That's all needs to be said.
Okay.
Yeah, you all are awesome. You're awesome.
For our listeners, make sure to check out the video, now available on Spotify and also on YouTube at youtube.com/radio22. Make sure to follow and like on our Facebook and IG at BLK Currency Podcast. And we appreciate everybody tuning in. This is another one. This is another one. We're gonna have to chop this up 80 different ways.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Thank you, Victor, for being a part of this. All of our audience and our listeners, we appreciate y'all tuning in. Until the next one.
Talk soon.
Peace.
Awesome. Peace.
Peace.
Ain't you sick of giving me your money?
I know he didn't do it, baby.
Whoa, where you going?
No, I'm about to go make these drop balls.